Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this evening's seminar. I need to apologise in case I cough through my part of this. Before I forget, next week, our seminar was due to be face-to-face, but will now be online only. Next week's seminar online only. Right, to this evening, and welcome everyone. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Claudia Schumann, who works as a researcher and teacher at Stokholm University, Department of Special Education, pursuing philosophical questions as these apply to education. Claudia is particularly interested in the intersection between epistemology and political theory. Recent work, in a current project, she's drawing on the work of Lukács's notion of reification, along with the work of Wittgenstein, Cavell, Oneness, and Crary. Recent publications include Becoming Things, Becoming World, on cosmopolitanism, reification, and education, what is called thinking in education, aversive education on happiness and critique, and Wittgenstein and philosophy of education. This evening, Claudia is going to talk to us about disability, autofiction, and moral imagination, and she'll be engaging with the works of, amongst others, I take it, Peter Singer, Alice Crary, Eva Kitai. Claudia, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to present my ideas today. I want to say something in advance, maybe that the presentation is based on a visual presentation, so I'm not going to be reading a text, and it's a text under progress still, developing for some time, and I'm very happy for the discussion. I'm very happy for input and thoughts, and it's maybe I could say something about the talk and what to expect. In the first half of the paper, I discuss more the literary and or artistic examples that I want to work with or focus on, think through. And then in the second part of the paper, I get more into the debate between Kitai and Singer and Alice Crary's philosophical response to that. And the kind of problems she formulates for philosophy of education based on that. And I also would like to say something about my own sort of approach to the topic I'm presenting on today. So I see myself more based in philosophy of education and rather new to the field of disability studies and critical disability studies. And the paper is more me sort of taking inspiration from these discourses and then trying to think through my own philosophical trajectory and also through philosophy of education and the kind of adjustments that I suggest or the kind of gaps or the kind of things that I want to highlight. That is a sort of more a critique or an internal critique that is directed to philosophy of education. So I just want to have this as a sort of a little disclaimer that there's still a lot for me to learn in the field of critical disability studies. And it's not like I think that philosophy should go in and fix for them. It's more that I think that philosophy has to fix some stuff and that they're helping through the issues sort of approached by those other disciplines, that's helpful way also to or that's a helpful challenge to some very basic philosophical tenets in moral theory. So I think after this short introduction, I maybe start sharing my screen, and would be nice if you gave me some feedback on whether you can see.
Yeah, that's clear to me.
Great, and you're very welcome to raise questions during the presentation. Also, you can write in the chat. Maybe Jan can have a little eye on that for those who don't dare to raise their hands. Otherwise, you have the raise of hands function, and then you can raise questions. So I'm not opposed. It's not like I have to run through this, and we cannot take a break for questions. Okay. So my talk for today is called Disability, Autofiction, and Moral Imagination. Moral imagination is a term that I take from Alice Crary that plays a quite central role in her moral philosophy. Autofiction relates very much to the sort of artistic works that I discuss. And disability with a slash is sort of has to do with sort of how we think body and bodily ability, physical ability, and disability in philosophy, and what kind of abilities implicitly or explicitly have played a role. So with sort of raising or bringing in or talking about disability with the slash in philosophy, and with this talk, I aim both at sort of, as one topic is challenging pedagogical forms and thinking through how can we rethink forms of doing pedagogy, but also to think through certain blind spots in the philosophy of education. So discussions of disability within philosophy of education are relatively absent, and what they're marginalized, and they're not, like, when you look at the main journals and you just search for topics, it's not like it's completely absent, but it's almost absent as a topic. And as one of the main arguments with this paper is also that an attentive turn to disability challenges generally held philosophical beliefs, and that a turn of attention will open up questions that are central rather than peripheral to philosophy of education. So the idea is not that this is a sort of a gap that, oh, we didn't think about that, now we do, and then we can fill this gap. It's more, this will force us to rethink certain notions that are still quite central in how philosophers talk about rationality. One big example that I'm gonna draw on here. And that also the sort of forgetfulness about disability, that this influences or has had a strong influence in how we conceptualize, for example, notions of rationality and moral status. So in that sense, turning the attention to discourses on disability and disability as a phenomenon is meant as a challenge to political philosophy, to ethics and moral theory. So in which context is disability a topic in philosophy? And there I talk about general philosophy. So we have discussions in the periphery of bioethics, that is like in relation to the treatment of newborns or elderly with severe cognitive impairments. We have discussions in the periphery of discussions on moral standing of animals. This is one of the discussions that I'm gonna relate to today, because it's in that kind of context that the debate between Singer and Kitai starts, and that then also Crary contributes to. And this is actually with like thinking through how we relate to animals and the moral questions regarding that this discussion about severely cognitive impairments started, and yeah, and we will turn to that later on in the paper. But then you can also say, and this I argue, there I follow Alice Crary, that implicitly actually there are tacit assumptions in I'm sorry, I'm trying to move the faces here better. So that tacit assumptions regarding as queries as moral standing is a direct function of the possession of particular capacities of the mind. So that in a large tradition of, and here I talk about analytic philosophy very much, but that also regards other traditions in philosophy, but that's the tradition that query mostly can be placed in, that moral standing is a direct function of the possession of particular capacities of the mind, then of course poses problems for the moral standing of persons with severe cognitive impairments. And the query argues that far from being merely specialized concerns, these questions are capable of shedding light on organizing presuppositions of contemporary moral philosophy. So one of the things is that a lot of these, as of the sort of forgetfulness that I talked about earlier, or this blind spot, but I think that forgetfulness about disability is a better expression maybe than a blind spot in philosophy. That this leads to this sort of highlights certain presuppositions that are not reflected upon and that are not explicitly coming to the fore in a lot of philosophical work, and then also in philosophy of education. So which bodies are neutral and which are political in philosophy and in education is one of the questions that I would like to raise. And then also for the body at all to place, or bodies to place, play a role in philosophy. That's also, and I think that's related, the sort of absence of the body is related to the absence of a disability also. I want to say something because now I talked about the absence of disability, that of course there are rather big names in philosophy, such as Julia Kristeva, for example, a very prominent figure who have written on disability. And I just want to mention her study, which can be watched as a videotaped lecture also, where she talks about vulnerability and develops a sort of emancipatory take on disability. And she received, amongst other, also criticisms for still upholding a sort of us and them, and that in the way she addresses the we, that implicitly there's sort of mechanisms of inclusion also in this construction of the we and them, and so on and so forth. And I want to mention that also in such approaches such as crip theory, where we study cultures of disability and queerness together, where disability studies and queer studies are merged, they have had a huge influence on a lot of work, also in education, also in special education. So my purpose is not to dismiss this, but and I do want to give credit to this kind of works and show that I'm aware that this also this exists and has had a huge influence, of course, about sort of raising the questions of dominant and marginal, bodily and sexual identities, and how this interconnects, how this just to place sort of my talk in a context is that Kristeva and also crip theory can be placed maybe more with the French or so-called continental tradition of philosophy, and then a sort of Wittgenstein tradition that I may come from, or also German philosophy is often placed somewhere in between, or like trying to find a place in between the analytical tradition, the Anglo-American analytical tradition, and the more continental philosophical tradition. And today, the kind of debates that I'm discussing and the kind of internal critique that I'm developing here, that is a philosophical critique, as I mentioned in the beginning, that is more to be placed within the more like analytical, so-called analytical tradition, if you want to have this broader context. And I think it's an important critique to raise there. It's an important to find ways of communicating. And I think that will come to the fore also with Kitai's response to Singer, and that it's important to lift these arguments and to, yeah, but that not dismissing that there are, okay. Yeah. And then my main, also John said that recently, and maybe I'm onto a new trend here, that disability is in the coming. But when you look, I actually did do that a year ago. I did quite an extensive research of the journals within philosophy of education, and there you can really, like, I didn't calculate the percentages, but it has a very, very marginal existence within philosophy of education. And I think it should have a bigger place, that it's valuable to look at. And I want to spend some time introducing the two examples, or I call it artistic examples. One is an autofiction, but a collective autofiction, and it's published in Swedish. It was by a group that was organized by the by a union for and it was a queer and a queer meeting place for young people with kind of severe handicaps that had difficulty also just like physically getting to the space, but some of them traveled for like 3 hours to come to these meetings. And they gathered, I think, twice a month, and then for a couple hours, and they worked with each other, but they also had writers come in as sort of teacher helpers. But then those 3 books that you see here are collections of poetic works, of also prosa. So it's different pieces of writing that were produced during these sessions, and that then it's publications by these young people that they organized on their own, and it's all available online. You can download it as PDF. It's also more in accessible forms, partly. And so I've like looked at some of the poems in there. I've looked at some of the sort of witness statements about what it meant for certain individuals to be in this group, what it meant to express itself artistically. And one thing that comes to the fore a lot is the importance of this collective writing process. And I thought that this was interesting in many ways, but that this like having a possibility to actually physically gather together is something that was a very prized experience or special experience, also in the process of producing text, in the process of thinking together, of understanding yourself, of then expressing yourself. And that as such is I think it's interesting to look at as like collective autofiction writing as a sort of pedagogical form and what that does, but also this getting together physically, which is an experience that after COVID-19 and all the online teaching and everybody being separated and just relating through screens has been written about also in philosophy of education, but in a way as this was the first time for everybody to have that kind of experience. I think in these writers you see much earlier that it's not possible for everybody to have this kind of physical meetings easily on a daily basis, etc. So it's something I think where that helps to broaden also the perception of this as what many experience as a sort of a seizure or a huge event, that this is a sort of a daily reality for other people that maybe just don't get the chance to express that so often. And another example I have drawn and think through in relation to pedagogical form is Lorenza Böttner, an artist. And here autofiction is maybe broadly because this artist worked not so much with writing, but more with painting primarily, and then also with performance and dance. But it's I think it's still fair to call that or to handle that under the term of autofiction, because there is a lot of fictionalizing engagement with the self and their own identity in the paintings, in the dancing expression. Collective autofiction is sort of the first, when I talk about pedagogical forms, that I want to think through with the help of these 3 books. I already explained that it's produced blended prose and poetry. There's also some paintings and sketches that maybe I forgot. And it's sort of a mix also between fiction and autofiction and more documentary portrayals. Some is also more like a manifesto writings. But that this sort of collective work with the literary process is both a meeting place for sharing experience, but also a place and time to reclaim and make visible as your own identities as both sex and sexual beings. And this also in resistance to the fact that these are aspects that are often being disregarded in public perception and portrayals of persons with disability. And what I take further is sort of this idea of the collective autofiction. And as I said, also kind of but it meant that for some it meant that it was like long weekly drives to the meetings, but that it meant very much to meet and to have that exchange with other youths in similar situations, and that it was the importance and the power of the actual physical gatherings. And this also in non-pandemic times. So I think that this brings meetings and workshops and writing and focus in a way that is fruitful for thinking through pedagogical forms, and that is this collective production of autofiction. I described as finding strength and joy in expressing together and learning about and better understanding oneself through this collective expression together with others. And one of the questions I've been thinking about is how philosophy of education and moral philosophy would be transformed by such forms of writings. And that's also a challenge sort of to how we practice philosophy and philosophy of education. And then from collective sort of autofiction, I go to dissident embodiment. And that is a way to describe the sort of one way to describe the artistic practice of Lorenza Böttner. As I said, she's a performance artist that was highlighted in Documenta 14, and then they're described as transforming a painting practice into performance art that took to the streets and made public space a stage for politicized bodily difference. And that the way in which Lorenza makes use of her body in her performance pieces illustrates how dissident embodiment itself can become a pedagogical form for the audience and also for philosophy of education, I think. That is also like, what kind of bodies do we meet at conferences? What kind of bodies, what kind of bodily enactment do we practice? And maybe if one was confronted with a sort of dissident embodiment a little bit more often, then maybe also our theories would look differently, or the kind of philosophizing practiced could be a different one. So I think that dissident embodiment is an interesting term to think about in relation to sort of also the conditions of production of philosophy of education. I'm not sure if we have how we're in with time, but maybe I can share. There's a link to where we can see, and it's at minute 31, where you can see Lorenza's performance and this kind of playfulness, also with clothing, also with dressing and undressing, in sort of the kind of the image that society has of how bodies, as Lorenza's body, should be dressed and placed in society, and how capable that body, or what this body is actually able to do. So I take two sort of quotes. One is from the books that I talked about earlier. It's a part of the poem where it says: jag vill att du förstår vad jag säger, jag gör vad jag vill, det är min kropp som rör sig väldigt mycket. And in English that is, I want you to understand what I say, I do what I want, this is my body, that moves a lot. And the body that moves very much is a body that is diagnosed with cerebral palsy. But I think that is also could be related very well to Lorenza Böttner, who in that one of the movies about her life documentary, she's interviewed, and then she says that, oh, I've been yeah, I can try to dress down and look bourgeois and fit in, but people will anyway notice. So instead I try to, like, I cannot do anything against this sort of being interpreted. It's not possible for me to blend in. So I might as well enjoy my eccentricity and play with it. And sort of, and you see her going shopping, and you see the sort of in a sort of more active choice for a dissident embodiment in a way that is embracing the body that moves a lot. It says, like, in some way I am an exhibitionist and I like it, I benefit from it, but I was not always an exhibitionist. I came as a result of my handicap, because people stare at me whether I'm dressed conservatively or very flamboyantly, but it's fun for me. So the way in which body practice, Böttner practices dissident embodiment in her performance pieces can be read as making good on what Lowe's poem asks for. And in one of the performance pieces, the Böttner plays with how society attempts to dress and hide her body in a way that hinders the movement, and contrasts this with letting the same body paint, dance, and clothes that actually fit and are made for that body, and that's supported and let it show in a way that allows us to see and listen to this body that also moves a lot. So from these two examples, we're also thinking of like different practical ways on how they can inform how we think forms of doing, philosophy of education, and forms of doing, thinking through pedagogical forms and other sort of educational settings. I then turn to this debate between Kitai and Singer and Crary, and it's a debate that was started by Singer's writings on animal rights, and where Singer is quite and it's a book that certainly has its benefits and has turned many people into vegetarians in order to be better at respecting animal rights. So it's not to like undermine the value of Singer's work in that sense, but one of the arguments he draws here is saying that he argues for animal rights by saying that there are human beings who have less cognitive ability than many animals, and by drawing sort of that that parallel, and he argues we need to think freely, and that's part of the sort of utilitarian tradition that Singer comes from, that it's so even if that is contrary to everyday morality, thinking freely is connected to a philosopher being objective and being able to play with different thought experiments. So he says that we can gain from playing with thoughts freely, even if that goes against more everyday morality. So it's by saying that, oh, actually the moral standing of some human beings should be below that of animals, that we then can lift or make arguments for strengthening animal rights and rethinking our practices of eating animals, of abusing animals in different kind of settings. And Crary has also written on animal rights. That's just as an aside, or on our practices of living with animals from a moral standpoint. And her point roughly could be summarized there, that there are ways to argue for animal rights in an as strong way as Singer does, without at the same time denigrating certain human beings or groups of human beings that historically have been already as a where historically you find in the National Socialist history in Germany some worst of the worst examples, but not only there, of exactly also this connected to this argumentation of that these human beings aren't worth as much as even an animal. So that he's like sort of flamboyantly repeating that argument, that this is not a necessary step sort of in then arguing for animal rights, and that's not like a necessarily evil on the way to the good of stopping cruelty against animals. And Kitai comes from a different sort of position. She's a mother of a person with severe cognitive impairment, and her text or her response to Singer and her outrage, and that is formulated in this response. And I think when reading one of her first sort of responses to Singer, you find I find a lot of admiration for her getting it together and writing a sort of a philosophical piece that makes strong arguments in itself, but that she argues very much from this point that the personal is philosophical and is political. So she's trying to defend also that her being, and that this is sort of how Singer dismisses her, as that, oh, but you're just talking as a mother and you're too subjective, and we have to be able to play with these thoughts against also everyday morality. So the way that he responds is a kind of a dismissal because of her being too personal. And then one of her response, she argues very strongly for her having this sort of personal relationship, that this actually qualifies her more than Singer to actually say something about the situation. And she points out that philosophical bioethics itself can be unethical in its methodology and import. So she demands epistemic responsibility and empirical adequacy and epistemic modesty also, all of which she argues Singer is missing to a large extent. And she also defends a notion of strong objectivity, and in that sense she's very close to Crary, that they're both, and Crary sort of supports Kitai, plus comes up with a sort of moral philosophy, and she develops a stand within moral philosophy that is very well developed and very very comprehensive. And and she sort of takes all this philosophical instruments that she's developed in order to support Kitai and to give more strength to the arguments that Kitai is making. So Kitai in a way already says this, that being closely acquainted with an issue also emotionally is not necessarily hindering an adequate objective judgment of the situation. And Crary sort of develops the sort of an analysis of the ontological and epistemological commitments that Singer's claims are based on, and beyond sort of pointing out this abhorrent historical parallels of his argumentation, she also says that she disagrees with the underlying philosophical commitments and how we could argue against those without even looking at the sort of consequences, but that this is sort of exactly this kind of immorality is a consequence of these underlying philosophical commitments. So in a way, you could say that the debate between Kitai, Singer, and Crary, to summarize, it's more that Kitai as a mother there is trying to make her voice heard in the what she describes as immoral, but it's a very ableist discourse in moral philosophy. And then the discussion becomes polarized between sort of the hurt mother and the objective philosopher. That doesn't mean ill, just arguing. And this sort of this dismissive attitude of Singer that then also has emotional costs for Kitai, which she articulates in the, or she describes in her article also, how she leaves the room and she's like, why am I even here? Why do I even care for continuing to be in this philosophical room with people who say these abhorrent things without, while calling themselves moral philosophers, etc. And then she kind of also gives arguments for like, why is it important to continue to insist being on this room in these rooms, and she says that she felt that it was a duty as her duty as a parent and as fellow citizen and also as an educator. And then she also gave this example of feminist philosophy, and that it's not the first time philosophy is shown in need of transformation, and that that part gave her hope. So one of the problems that sort of shows up there in this debate is the problem of basing moral status and legal rights in capacities. It's this sort of how we think about autonomy and sort of our interdependence and codependence, our belonging with others and dependence on others, and that relation to being an autonomous individual, and how much this like ability to be autonomous and independent then contributes to our having legal rights and certain moral status. But it's also that a lot of these discussions on moral status, on legal rights historically have been putting much weight on faculties of the mind and not so much on the status of the body at all. So in that sense, this very sort of creates a difficult starting point for example, people with severe cognitive impairment. And then we have query suggestion to, and here I can really just give a sketch. I hope to do better in the text later. But she develops an alternative account of how both human life and animal life can be based, and the value of human life and animal life can be based on an alternative account of moral standing. And when you see there's like the debate continues and Singer responds to query, and it becomes also, he does not acknowledge this sort of as a possibility of a different account of moral standing. As query writes, Singer ties creatures' moral status to individual capacities, of which human beings typically receive the biggest morally relevant portion. He thus weakens his own advocacy on behalf of our fellow creatures. So by sort of using abilities that human beings statistically have more of, or usually the sort of general majority has, then and making this the morally relevant capacity, she says he already creates a sort of distinction, or it goes shapes the sort of hierarchy and obtains it, which he then is trying to argue against. And she says that this traffic in the comparisons is problematic and objectionable, not only because it encourages the further marginalization of an already vulnerable group of human beings, but also because, with regard to the quest for a better understanding of the value in human life, it encourages us to look resolutely, in Kitai's phrase, in the wrong place. So she's arguing for rethinking this whole idea of binding the value of human life to individual capacities, of binding that, or basing that, basing moral status on individual capacities. And this kind of I like this phrase, problematic moralism of moral theory, or that way in which sort of moral theory itself can be immoral, or there can be an unethical nature to ethical arguments. Or she describes a problematic moralism of moral theory. She does that in early works also. And for me, that was eye-opening when I read Query many years ago, because it described a feeling that I had with a lot of moral philosophy, even before the sort of, as a reading Singer in this exchange is kind of, it's so in your face if you have any kind of sensitivity towards these issues. But I find that also in other parts of moral theory, and I think that Query is exquisite, as she writes in a really fantastic way. It gives an analysis of how she sees that this problematic moralism, what the sort of the structure is that this is based on, and what the sort of problematic consequences are. One thing that also I think in this debate between Singer and Kitai and Query sort of strikes me again, and this is why I think it's interesting also to read Kitai's first response, is with someone who's not listening. And this sort of on the one hand, being hypervisible, if we would have dissident embodiment in certain conference situations, that would be a hypervisibility that would be experienced as exhibitionist. But it might also force someone to listen. That's some kind of speculation that I'm into with the dissident embodiment. But it also forces sort of to rethink this sort of dismissal of some of with critical disability studies. There's a history of saying, oh, but this is too activist, this is not really research, this is not really, and the sort of dismissing based on false notions of neutrality, false notions of objectivity. And I think here Query is really after something. It's sort of on this very basic level, arguing for no, it's not that we that we shouldn't uphold an idea of neutrality or objectivity. It's that you adhere to a wrong notion of objectivity, you adhere to a wrong notion of neutrality, because it's absurd to think that in order to be objective, we have to abstract from everything that is emotion. We have to abstract from everything that was destroy how we orientate ourselves in language. This is not how we learn language. This is not how we initiate it. And this is already within a sort of life world experience that is already shaped also by emotions. Sometimes being objective needs a sort of educating of the sensitivities, and an extra special focus on educating these sensitivities. It's not abstracting from those. And of course, it means abstracting from certain emotion, or abstracting or stepping back from some emotions that might be very problematic in one, but it's not this sort of general abstracting from everything that is that can be in question. So Query writes, there can be no question of getting aspects of the world, such as human and animal lives, in view in ethics simply in the manner envisioned by Singer, by attending to them in a manner purged of pernicious prejudices. What is required in addition is an active effort to develop ourselves. So my suggestion is that both the examples I talked about in the beginning, this collective writing project, and also Lorenzo Butner's work and the corresponding pedagogical forms, can highlight interesting aspects when looking at the exchange between Singer and Kitai. It highlights some interesting aspects that are relevant for how we in the philosophy of education look at the role of the body and disability, highlighting and making the body perceptible through dissident embodiment, and philosophical writing and understanding through collective autofiction. So in Singer's argumentation, we can find how a rigid and narrow understanding of rationality can lead to a disturbing opposition to the needs and sensitivities of the communities affected, who the scholars involved are writing about, developing and defending their arguments, while, quote by Query, simply refusing to listen. And we can, that's enough. There's similar problems in other debates. So, and then my argument in the paper that I'm hoping to finish at some point on this project is that the importance and the value of literature and the arts for philosophy and philosophy of education, and of such projects as Min Stolthet and the work of Lorenzo Butner are not about the incredible artistic capacity or literary quality or acute analysis of the situation only, but it is also about the way in which these works reveal the shortcomings of what Query calls the abstraction requirement in moral reasoning, and with this drawing attention to and confronting some of the problematic moralism of moral theory. I think that these works can transform us and our criteria within philosophy of education by showing us a life and what matters in that life. And this is sort of what Crary works with a lot, that also through literary works, we can learn what matters in a life, and that this is how we understand what matters in human life, or why human life can matter, but also why animal life, or in what way animal life matters. And that this means educating sensitivities and not abstracting from them. So the discourse around disability give additional reason to critically revisit the status and understanding of rationality in relation to moral theory, as well as the relation between rationality and fiction, or in Crary's terms, the need for cultivating sensitivities and developing our moral imagination in order to get a rational grasp of the world, human life and animal life. In this way, they deeply challenge generally held philosophical beliefs and open up questions central rather than peripheral to ethics. So, and that was the end of the talk today. And I'm glad you stayed with me so long. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you very much, Claudia. There's lots and lots there.
Should I stop sharing screen, or?
Yeah, I maybe stop sharing now so we can see